My uncle borrowed $50K for medical bills that turned out to be gambling debts. The loan shark he owed had interesting payment plans. Growing up, my uncle was always the fun one at family gatherings, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh until their sides hurt. He had this infectious energy that could light up any room, and honestly, I looked up to him more than my own dad sometimes. So when he came to me last spring with tears in his eyes, talking about mounting medical bills from his recent heart surgery, I didn't hesitate for a second. The man who taught me how to throw a curveball and sneak candy before dinner was sitting in my living room, broken and desperate. His hands shook as he explained how the insurance company was fighting every claim, how the hospital was threatening to send collectors after him. I felt this crushing weight in my chest watching him struggle to get the words out, this proud man who never asked anyone for anything. Without thinking twice, I liquidated most of my savings account and took out a personal loan to cover the rest. $50,000 felt like a fortune to me, but seeing him that vulnerable made money seem insignificant. I handed him the check with a smile, telling him family comes first and he could pay me back whenever he got back on his feet. For the next few months, everything seemed normal enough. He'd call regularly to check in, always asking about my job and whether I was dating anyone new. We'd grab beers on weekends, and he seemed healthier than ever, his color back and energy restored. I felt good about helping him through such a rough patch, proud that I could be there when he needed me most. Then one Tuesday evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, but carried an edge that made my blood run cold. The man explained that my uncle owed him money, significant money, and that he'd given my contact information as a reference. My heart started pounding as I realized this wasn't about medical bills at all. The caller, who introduced himself only as Marcus, laid out the situation with disturbing clarity. My uncle had been gambling heavily for over 2 years, racking up debts at underground poker games and sports betting operations. The $50,000 I'd given him went straight to paying off one creditor, but there were others, and the interest was compounding daily. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. All those times he'd seemed so healthy and energetic, he'd been living a double life. The man I'd trusted with my life savings had used me as a pawn in his addiction. Anger and betrayal washed over me in waves, but underneath it all was this crushing disappointment that hurt worse than anything. Marcus explained that since my uncle had listed me as a guarantor, I was now partially responsible for the debt. My stomach dropped as he mentioned the amount, another $60,000 on top of what I'd already given. I tried to explain that I'd never agreed to guarantee anything, but he just chuckled and said my uncle had been very convincing about my willingness to help. The next few days were a blur of panic and sleepless nights. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus at work, couldn't think about anything except how I'd been played. My savings were gone, I had a personal loan to pay off, and now these people were expecting me to cover even more of my uncle's mistakes. I felt trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. When I finally confronted my uncle, he broke down completely. He admitted everything through tears and apologies, explaining how it started small but spiraled out of control. He'd been chasing losses with bigger bets, borrowing from dangerous people to cover previous debts. The heart surgery story was completely fabricated, a manipulation designed to tug at my heartstrings. Watching him confess felt like watching someone die. This person who'd been such a huge part of my life was basically a stranger. I'd given him everything based on lies, and now we were both drowning because of his choices. Part of me wanted to comfort him, but a bigger part wanted to scream at him for destroying everything. Marcus called again the following week, this time with a proposition that caught me completely off guard. Instead of demanding immediate payment, he offered what he called a flexible arrangement. He ran several legitimate businesses around the city and needed someone with my background to help with some projects. The work would be completely legal, he assured me, but the pay would go directly toward the debt. I was suspicious but desperate enough to listen. He explained that he owned a small moving company, a storage facility, and a few other operations that needed reliable help. The pay was decent, and he'd credit it against what my uncle owed at a favorable rate. It seemed too good to be true, but I was running out of options fast. My first assignment was helping coordinate logistics for the moving company. It was straightforward work, scheduling crews and managing inventory, nothing that raised any red flags. The other employees seemed normal enough, just regular people trying to make a living. I started to think maybe Marcus was actually trying to help rather than exploit the situation. But as weeks turned into months, I began noticing things that didn't add up. Certain moves happened at odd hours, always to or from expensive neighborhoods. Some of the items we transported were wrapped in unusual ways, and the clients paid exclusively in cash. I tried to convince myself it was just wealthy people being eccentric, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The storage facility work was even stranger. I'd be asked to move specific units during overnight shifts, always alone and without any paperwork. The containers were heavy and sealed, and I was explicitly told never to open them or ask questions. The pay for these special assignments was significantly higher, which helped chip away at the debt faster. One night while working late at the storage facility, I accidentally knocked over a partially open container. Stacks of bills scattered across the floor, more cash than I'd ever seen in my life. My hands trembled as I quickly gathered everything up, trying to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't shake the image of all that money just sitting there in the dark. The next morning, Marcus called me into his office with a knowing smile. He'd reviewed the security footage and seen my little accident. Instead of being angry, he seemed almost pleased that I'd discovered his secret. He explained that the storage facility was essentially a bank for people who preferred to keep their money off the books. My heart sank as I realized I'd been helping launder money for months. Every night shift, every mysterious container, every cash payment had been part of an elaborate illegal operation. I'd gone from being a victim of my uncle's gambling to becoming an unwitting accomplice in organized crime. The irony was devastating. Marcus offered me a choice that made my blood run cold. I could continue working for him, with full knowledge of what I was doing, and earn enough to pay off all the debts within a year. Or I could walk away, but the original debt would stand plus interest, plus penalties for my accidental discovery of his operation. I spent days agonizing over the decision. Walking away meant financial ruin and possibly physical danger. Staying meant becoming a criminal, betraying everything I'd been raised to believe. Either path felt like losing a piece of my soul, but I couldn't see any other options. In the end, I chose to stay, convincing myself it was temporary and that I'd find a way out eventually. The work became more explicit, with Marcus explaining exactly what I was helping to hide. I learned about shell companies, offshore accounts, and methods of moving money that would make investigators' heads spin. My uncle's gambling debt had turned me into an expert in financial crimes. The strangest part was how normal it all felt after a while. I'd go to work, move money around, file fake paperwork, and then go home to watch television like nothing had happened. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I'd learned to compartmentalize just to survive. I became someone I didn't recognize, and that scared me more than anything. Marcus treated me well, almost like a son, which made everything more complicated. He'd invite me to family dinners, ask about my dating life, and give me advice about investments. It was hard to hate someone who was so genuinely interested in my well-being, even though he'd essentially enslaved me through my uncle's debt. My uncle, meanwhile, had disappeared completely. He'd moved out of state without telling anyone, leaving me to deal with the consequences of his actions alone. Sometimes I'd wonder if he even knew what his debt had cost me, or if he was just grateful to be free of it. The abandonment hurt almost as much as the initial betrayal. After about 8 months of working for Marcus, something unexpected happened. Federal agents raided the storage facility during one of my shifts, catching me red-handed with containers full of cash. My heart stopped as they shouted commands and pointed weapons at me. Everything I'd feared was finally happening. But instead of arresting me, the lead agent pulled me aside and revealed that they'd been building a case against Marcus for years. They'd been monitoring his operations and had identified me as a potential cooperating witness. My uncle, it turned out, had been working with them all along, feeding them information about Marcus's organization in exchange for protection. The revelation that my uncle had orchestrated everything, including my involvement, left me speechless. He'd used me as bait to get close to Marcus, knowing that my financial desperation would make me vulnerable. The medical bills story, the gambling debts, even my recruitment into the organization had all been part of an elaborate undercover operation. I felt like I'd been living in a movie where everyone knew the plot except me. My uncle wasn't a gambling addict. He was an undercover consultant helping the feds build their case. My months of illegal work weren't just about paying off debt, they were about gathering evidence. Everything I'd believed about the situation was completely wrong. The agents offered me immunity in exchange for my testimony, but the emotional damage was already done. I'd spent months thinking I was a criminal, hating myself for compromising my values, all while unknowingly helping to catch the real criminals. The psychological whiplash was almost unbearable. Marcus's arrest happened the following week, and I watched from across the street as they led him away in handcuffs. The man who'd been like a father figure to me was actually a dangerous criminal, and I'd been his unwitting accomplice. The relationships I'd built, the trust I'd developed, all of it had been built on lies from both sides. My uncle finally called me after the arrest, trying to explain his actions and apologize for putting me through everything. He'd been working with federal investigators for years, helping them understand how these operations worked. When they needed someone on the inside, he'd volunteered me without my knowledge, thinking it would be a short-term assignment. I couldn't decide whether to be proud of helping catch criminals or furious about being manipulated by everyone I'd trusted. The $50,000 I'd originally lent him was returned with interest, but no amount of money could repair the damage to our relationship. I'd been used by both sides, and the betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. The trial lasted several months, and I testified about everything I'd witnessed and participated in. Seeing Marcus in court, looking small and defeated, made me realize how dangerous the situation had actually been. Other witnesses testified about violence and intimidation that I'd been shielded from, making me grateful for my uncle's protection even as I resented his methods. Now, more than a year later, I'm still processing everything that happened. My uncle and I barely speak, and when we do, it's awkward and strained. Family gatherings are tense, with everyone tiptoeing around the subject of what happened. I've learned to live with the knowledge that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The experience taught me that even the people closest to you can harbor secrets that change everything. My uncle's gambling story was a lie, but his willingness to sacrifice our relationship for what he thought was the greater good was real. I'm still not sure which betrayal hurt more, the initial deception or the revelation that it was all calculated. Looking back, I realized that both my uncle and Marcus were trying to protect me in their own ways. My uncle kept me ignorant of the real plan to shield me from the stress of knowing I was helping the feds. Marcus treated me well because he genuinely liked me, even though our relationship was built on criminal enterprise. The money is gone, the relationships are damaged, and I'm left with trust issues that affect every aspect of my life. But I'm also alive, free, and wiser about the complexity of human motivations. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who think they're helping us, and that's a lesson I'll carry forever. My uncle's gambling debts were fake, but the consequences for our family were very real. The loan shark's interesting payment plans turned out to be a federal investigation, and the medical bills that started it all were just the opening move in a game I didn't know I was playing. These days, I'm more careful about who I trust and why. I've learned to ask more questions, to look for inconsistencies, and to protect myself even when helping others. The experience changed me fundamentally, making me more cynical but also more resilient. I survived something that could have destroyed me, and that knowledge gives me strength. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd refused to help my uncle from the beginning. Would the federal investigation have proceeded differently? Would Marcus have been caught anyway? Would my uncle have found another way to get close to the organization? The what-ifs can drive you crazy if you let them. But I also know that I acted out of love, even if that love was exploited. When someone you care about is in trouble, you help them even if it costs you everything. That instinct to protect family is what made me vulnerable, but it's also what makes me human. I wouldn't trade that compassion for anything, even knowing the price I paid for it. The whole experience lasted just over a year, but it felt like a lifetime. I went from being a naive young man who trusted everyone to someone who questions everything. The transformation was painful but necessary, and I'm still learning to balance healthy skepticism with the ability to form genuine connections. My uncle's story about medical bills turned out to be elaborate fiction, but the emotions it triggered were completely real. The fear of losing someone you love, the desperation to help, the willingness to sacrifice everything for family, those feelings can be manipulated, but they're also what make us human. In the end, I learned that even the most complicated situations usually come down to simple human emotions: love, fear, greed, and the desire to do what's right. My uncle loved me enough to involve me in something dangerous to protect others. Marcus was greedy enough to exploit my situation, but human enough to treat me with kindness. I was naive enough to trust everyone, but strong enough to survive the consequences. The loan shark's interesting payment plans turned out to be more interesting than I could have ever imagined. Instead of breaking my legs, they broke my innocence. Instead of destroying my credit, they destroyed my ability to trust easily. But they also taught me that I'm tougher than I thought, more resilient than I knew, and capable of surviving even the most impossible situations.